Okay, let's get some analysis now from the chair of the Trump campaign, Rob Arlett. He joins me from Bethany Beach in the state of Delaware. Rob, really appreciate your time. Now, just judging from some of your remarks on Twitter, you seem to support President Trump's stance on what we're seeing in the U.S. when we talk about Democrats leading Minneapolis, and he says, look what's going on now. It's a Democrat-led state. Do you believe that these protests are purely because of the political beliefs of the leaders, considering that Georgia and Texas are red states, but there have also been violent protests there?
No, in general, I would say no. I think as protests continue and start, we are very sad, and it's very unfortunate, of course, what happened to Mr. Floyd. And I think that our hearts and souls reach out to he and his family. And I think originally, as people go out into the streets and share their First Amendment right to be able to protest, is something that we welcome here in America. And I think even as President Trump certainly encourages people to voice their opinion, but when it shifts to violence and when it shifts to acts of horrific violence and destruction of personal properties, when it no longer becomes protesting, but when it becomes rioting. And I think that's something that no leader of any community should welcome, no leader should ever encourage. And I think that's where the line has to get drawn. There is a very large difference between one that is protesting, voicing their opinion and dissatisfaction with something, and then when it shifts to being, I should say, very destructive and harmful to other people, is when things need to change. And that's when we need to have and demand our elected officials to stand up and denounce these acts of violence.
Well, Rob,
against
elected officials in Minneapolis have stood up and denounced any acts of violence. Yesterday, we had the governor coming out. We had Minneapolis's mayor, both saying the same things, that acts of violence will not actually be tolerated during these protests. But I just want to touch on something that we heard from...
But not all, I must admit to you. But I will tell you, there's the U.S. Congresswoman who represents that very district is actually encouraging violence. If you go on to her Twitter account, you will see where she has actually suggested and encouraged acts of violence. And I think that's what I'm referring to. I think the rhetoric has to stop with regard to the encouraging of acts of violence. And that I think we need to call on all of our elected officials to ensure that they do that.
Rob, I want to touch on something that President Trump has said. We actually played a soundbite from him, and he spoke about America needing creation, not destruction, and that there will not be any anarchy. He's also, of course, offered his sympathies to George Floyd's family and said that something like this should never have happened in America. However, he's not actually said anything about addressing institutionalized racism in the country that's been around for decades.
Well, I don't think it's as bad as what people or the media actually seem to think that it really is.
I think many black people in America would disagree with you on that, Rob, and I think that's evident in the protests that we're seeing in the country. I mean, a lot of those protests have been peaceful. They started off peacefully. They may have been hijacked by those trying to take advantage of the situation, but I think a lot of people of color in the States will say that they don't feel they're being treated fairly.
Well, I think my wife is a woman of color, as are my children. And I think in the end, I think we are, as Americans, we are Americans. And I think there are definitely people within our society that, as you just mentioned, encourage division, encourage people to hate each other. And I think that's, unfortunately, people who, in many cases, I think want that for political gain. But I think just this morning, just 8 hours ago, there's a dear friend of mine who's a pastor, an African-American leader here in our beloved state of Delaware, calling and denouncing, of course, these acts of violence, but again, also one of unity. And I think in the end, we are a very unified people. I think, yes, you have these acts of violence, and I think sometimes they have bad motivations. And I think they're looking to expand the narrative of hatred and division in our country. And again, I don't think that's the majority. I really do believe, as do many, think that it is very few. And I think when people are getting paid to go out and act destructive towards other people, I think that's when, again, the narrative has got to shift, and that's when transparency, and we need to find out really who is causing this destruction, who is causing this hatred, and then eventually call them out and then hold them accountable. And I do believe that here in the coming days, if not hours, I do believe that President Trump will denounce Antifa and officially call them out as an act of domestic terrorism. And I think you will start to see some things very different here in America with regard to Antifa, that organization, and the hatred that they have towards humankind. And I think, again, President Trump is going to step up in the Department of Justice and call out that organization as a domestic terrorism. And I think you'll start to see some things change here in the very near coming hours, if not days.
Well, hopefully Americans can put aside their differences and talk it through, and unity will prevail. Rob Arlett, live to us there from Bethany Beach. Thank you for your input.
Thank you.